Security now. The homeless man didn't move, sir. Final warning, 41 minutes. His voice was flat, certain. After that, you won't need security. You'll need a crane. You have no idea what you're talking about. Memo CR 88112, January 2019. I wrote it. I told them exactly where it would fail. A pause. They didn't read it either. Dead silence. Because the number he just said, that number didn't exist in any public document. Anywhere. Ever. A $4 million car dying on the street. A billionaire with no options. And the only man alive who could stop it was the Manzili were trying to arrest. Planets. The clock was already running. 3 years ago, Tyrell Wade designed technology worth millions. This morning, he woke up under a bridge, and by afternoon, everything was going to change. He was already awake when the sky was still dark. 5:17 m. The underpass on Caldwell Street held the particular cold of late September. The kind that came through concrete and settled in your joints before you registered it as temperature. Tyrell lay on his back, on the foam pad he'd found outside a furniture store 6 months ago, and stared at the underside of the bridge above him. 17 cracks. Same as yesterday, same as the day before. He got up without making a sound, feet on pavement, body upright. No groaning, no slow performance of waking. That was the first rule he'd made for himself in the early weeks. When everything else was still collapsing, get up the same way every morning, regardless of how the night went. Because the morning was the only thing he could control, and control had to start somewhere. He folded his foam pad and tarp with deliberate attention. Corner to corner, edges aligned. The same care he used to bring to technical drawings, not because anyone was watching, but because how you did small things was how you did all things. He'd believed that before. He still believed it, maybe more now than before. He tucked everything into his bag alongside the items he'd assembled over months of careful accumulation. 2 protein bars, a water bottle he refilled at the park fountain, a travel toothbrush worn to almost nothing, 3 graphite pencils he'd salvaged from an art school's recycling bin, and a growing stack of folded paper dense with calculations in his own handwriting. He walked 8 minutes to the public restroom at Caldwell Park. Inside, he brushed his teeth, washed his face with the soap from Spencer. Full this morning, which was not always the case. Ran wet hands through his close-cut hair. Looked at himself in the mirror for long enough to confirm what he needed to confirm. He still looked like a man with somewhere to be. That mattered, not for anyone else. For him, Tyrell Wade was 38 years old, 6'1". He carried himself with the upright steadiness of someone who had once stood at the front of rooms full of engineers and made them all feel the gap between what they knew and what he knew. Not with arrogance, but with the particular confidence of a man who had done the work long enough to trust his own mind completely. His beard had grown out over 3 years in a way that had moved through unkempt and arrived somewhere closer to considered. His jacket was clean because he cleaned it every Tuesday at the laundromat on Vine. $2 for the washer, 75 cents for 15 minutes of dryer. His shoes were worn because shoes wore down. He stepped into the morning and kept walking. The library opened at 8. He was always the first one through the door. The woman at the front desk, Paulette, who had been there long enough to know the building's every mechanical complaint, didn't look up when he came in. Not anymore. In the beginning, she'd watched him with the careful attention people gave to situations they weren't sure how to categorize. Now she said, "Morning, Tyrell," the way you greeted someone whose schedule you'd memorized without meaning to. He went to his table, far left corner, back against the wall. Old habit from his years working in buildings full of people who smiled at you in the corridor and talked about you in conference rooms. He liked seeing the door, liked knowing what was approaching before it arrived. He pulled out his papers and arranged them with quiet efficiency. 3 technical journals he'd retrieved from the recycling site outside Hendrix corporate campus the previous Thursday. A company called Meridian Tech had apparently cleared out their conference room library. Their loss. He smoothed the covers and opened the first one to an article on quantum thermal regulation for high-density computing infrastructure. He read for 2 hours without moving. Not to impress anyone. Not because a deadline was coming. The part of his brain processed fluid dynamics and heat transfer and pressure relationships had never developed an off switch. It had been running continuously since the first thermodynamics course he'd taken at MIT at 18. And 3 years of sidesks and sheltered dinners had not changed that. If anything, the quiet had given it more room. Around 10, he turned to the blank side of an already used page and began writing. Fast at first, then slower, the way you write when a thought keeps moving just ahead of you. He was working through a modification to the cooling architecture in the second journal. Their approach was competent, but were missing something in the third loop, a geometry problem. He could see the solution forming but hadn't landed it yet. His pencil stopped. He was staring at his own handwriting without reading it, and he was Cephals. 2019, March, Creston Dynamics, 7th floor. The kind of office that installed floor-to-ceiling windows because the people inside had earned the right to feel elevated above things. Terrell's whiteboard covered most of one wall. His team occupied the cluster of desks nearest the windows. 5 engineers, he selected himself. Good ones. The kind who argued with him when he was wrong and moved fast when he was right. They were 14 months into designing a thermal management system for a next-generation satellite communications array. The kind of project that ended up in textbooks if it were. He'd love that job so much the uncomplicated intensity of someone doing exactly the thing they were built for. Gerald Moss had called him into the executive conference room on Tuesday in February. Gerald was VP of Engineering. 50, then, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who had been genuinely skilled once and had spent the years since converting in with past skill into a present authority that no longer required him to be skilled. He wore a watch that cost more than some people's monthly rent. He spoke with the measured ease of someone who had learned that projecting certainty was more efficient than achieving it. "We're moving the demo date," Gerald said. Terrell had looked across the long table. By how much? Forward. 60 days. The room held that particular silence of people deciding whether to say the true thing. Terrell said the true thing. That's not workable. We're in Phase 2 thermal cycle testing. Skipping Phase 3 means we won't have sustained slowed performance data for the secondary loop. We'll be flying blind on the failure modes. Gerald's expression didn't shift. The investor timeline is fixed. The decision came from above my level. It hadn't. Terrell found that out later. By then, it didn't help. He filed his objection in writing. Memo CR 88-112, January 14, 2019. The second February 3 escalated and copied to the division head. Then a third, March 1, 9 days before the demonstration. The prototype failed on March 10. Cascade thermal failure, $40 million in losses. The kind of failure that generated its own momentum. Investigations, board meetings, the search for an explanation that satisfied the people who needed explaining to. Gerald Moss stood before the board of directors and delivered his account in the careful, regretful voice of a man sharing thick guilt news. The failure originated from a fundamental flaw in the core thermal design, a design attributable to the lead engineer's team. The internal communication server was reset 72 hours after the incident. Standard security protocol following a significant technical failure, the company said, protecting proprietary data. Terrell had no copies of his memos. He'd filed them through official channels, through the systems he'd trusted to work the way systems were supposed to work. The investigation took 8 months. For 8 months, his name was the word people used when they talked about the Creston disaster. Former colleagues stopped returning calls. Job applications went into silence. Professional networks went quiet in the way they go quiet when someone has become associated with loss. Not by accusation, just by proximity. The investigation cleared him. Insufficient evidence of personal negligence. The documentation that would have explained the sequence of decisions had been lost in the server reset. neither convicted nor fully exonerated. In legal terms, those were the same thing. In professional terms, they were not. Nobody hired insufficient evidence. Nobody had called back insufficient evidence. Nobody had lunch with insufficient evidence to talk about what might come next. By the time the investigation concluded, Terrell had 3 months of rent remaining. He spent those months applying for positions at 38 companies. He heard back from 5, interviewed at 3, was told in various careful phrasings. Overqualified, not a current fit. The team is moving in a different direction. He understood what the phrasings meant. He had been in enough professional rooms to know what people said when they meant something they decided not to say directly. When the money ran out, he moved in with his cousin for 6 weeks. Then that arrangement ended. Not badly, just with the particular quiet exhaustion of someone who can't sustain the weight of another person's crisis indefinitely. He didn't blame her. He found the foam pad outside the furniture store 3 days later. Back in the library, Terrell blinked. He folded the memory away. Methodically, without sentiment, the way you filed a report you'd reviewed enough times to have memorized, and returned to the journal. The cooling architecture problem was still waiting. He found the solution 11 minutes later. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, he walked 12 blocks to the Westbrook Community Shelter on Marker Street. There was a common room in the back with folding tables and a whiteboard on wheels that had been through enough years to have its own history. A rotation of 7 to 15 children showed up on those evenings, ages 8 to 14, with varying degrees of willingness for what Terrell called science hour and what the kids called stuff that actually makes sense. He hadn't been recruited. There was no program, no formal arrangement. He'd arrived one evening and found 3 kids sitting on the floor with a broken transistor radio, and he'd sat down with them. That was 18 months ago. Now they had regulars. Jim was 12, with a gift for spatial reasoning that would embarrass most graduate students and a practiced pose of finding everything marginally beneath his attention. A pose that dissolved completely the moment a problem actually caught him. Amara was 10, kept a composition notebook in which she wrote down things, Terrell said in the cadence of someone archiving material for future use. She asked more follow-up questions per minute than most professional seminars Terrell had attended. Old Lou was 57, technically not a child, who kept appearing on science evenings because, as he said, the kids explained it better than the internet. Terrell taught them to see the problem before they tried to solve it. No formulas for their own sake. No memorization. He taught them that every system had a logic, and their job was to find it. Not borrow someone else's explanation of it, but find it themselves. When you find it yourself, he told Amara once, while they were donated fan to locate a grinding noise, it's yours. Nobody can take that. She'd written it down. He hadn't expected that. Those 3 evenings were the only hours in which Terrell felt entirely certain he was still real. Not in a dark sense. In the plain, honest sense that there are periods in a person's life when the primary evidence of your own existence is the fact that you have something to give. He was still giving. That was the thread he held. He found the magazine on a Thursday. Park bench, corner of Caldwell and 8th. Left behind or forgotten, slightly damp at the edges, folded open to the middle pages. He almost kept walking. Then his eye caught the diagram. Not because he was looking for one. Pattern recognition didn't ask permission. A diagram in a technical publication registered in his brain the way a musician's ear catches a wrong chord in a crowded room. Before the conscious minds to pay attention. He sat down and looked at it. Meridian Tech unveils breakthrough thermal platform for quantum processing infrastructure. Below the headline, a half-page architectural diagram. Elegant multi-loop, labeled with the careful precision of someone who understood what they were drawing. He traced the logic of it without touching the page. Primary circuit, secondary diversion, tertiary stabilization ring. The proportions, the force flow relationships, the geometry at the interface point where the secondary and tertiary systems converged. He stopped. Small print at the bottom of the diagram. Patent reference. 8-557-29. He sat with that for a moment. AT579 was his patent, filed in 2017. An approach to secondary loop thermal isolation that he'd developed over 8 months and considered, without false modesty, one of the cleaner pieces of engineering work he'd ever produced. Creston had held this license. After the disaster, after he was gone, they'd sold it to Meridian Tech. So the technology in this diagram, the one Meridian was calling a breakthrough, the one generating investor interest ahead of a major product launch. It had come from Terrell's mind, built on his geometry, running on his math. He looked at the diagram, then at the bench, the park, the commuters moving past without slowing. He felt something, but it wasn't the anger he might have expected. What he felt was more like the specific exhaustion of a man who has watched the world use his mind without knowing his face so many times that the act of recognition had become routine. He was tired in a way that lived below the surface and didn't go away with sleep. He folded the magazines and put it in his bag, stood up, kept walking. He heard the car before he saw it. 2 blocks from the library, at the edge of the Caldwell Industrial Corridor where the tech campuses began. Clean buildings that had arrived in this neighborhood over the past decade and brought parking fees, and people who walked fast and looked at their phones. The sound reached him first. A high-performance engine. The specific pitch of a Vortex Zenith's quad-motor thermal drive. A sound Cyril to recognize because he'd spent 4 months consulting on the cooling specifications for its predecessor at Creston before the Ariana Group had taken the automotive application in a separate direction. 17 of these cars existed in the world. He'd read about the production run in a discarded industry newsletter. But something was wrong with it. A sub-second irregularity in the harmonic pattern. A stutter that appeared every 8 or 9 cycles, so brief it registered as texture rather than event. You would never catch it from a driver's seat, never identify it in a standard diagnostic review. You might catch it if you'd helped design the thermal architecture its cooling system descended from. He stopped walking. Smoke, faint, grayish-blue, rising from the engine compartment in threads that told him exactly what was happening inside, and exactly how long he had before it became something irreversible. He stood on the sidewalk and ran the calculation. Microfracture in the secondary coolant loop. Vapor from the leaked coolant contacting the thermal shielding in the tertiary chamber. Not yet critical, but moving toward it. 40 to 43 minutes before cascade failure reached the quanta stabilization bearings. After that, factory disassembly. The driver's door opened. Daniel Holt was not a man who stood on sidewalks looking uncertain. That was apparent before he spoke. 45 years old, built with the deliberate maintenance of someone who considered fitness part of the job. Dressed in the fitless way that required significant expense to achieve. He stepped from the Vortex Zenith with his phone already at his ear and began moving in the tight, contained circle of a man accustomed to solving problems and currently finding that the usual methods weren't producing results. He ended one call, started another. Looked at the smoke and back at his screen, scanned the street. The small crowd accumulating on the opposite sidewalk had at least 2 phones pointed in his direction, which he registered and angled slightly away from. Terrell had seen that reflex before. The instinctive management of a man whose public image was a professional asset. He started walking toward the car. He wasn't entirely certain why. He told himself it was the same instinct that had stopped him at the magazine. Pattern recognition. The inability to walk past a visible problem. But underneath that was something else. Something that had been building for 3 years of knowing things and having nowhere to put them. He stopped 10 feet away, kept his hands where they could be seen. When he spoke, he used the voice from the conference rooms, not requesting anything, simply stating, "The secondary cooling loop. There's a fracture in the second circuit. That's what the smoke is." Daniel looked at him. The look was fast and complete. It started at Terrell's face and moved down, took in the jacket, the bag, the shoes, assembled a conclusion and filed it in under 2 seconds. "Step back from the vehicle." "I'm not near the vehicle, sir." The tone shifted, the practiced authority of someone whose instructions were usually followed without discussion. I don't need assistance right now. You need the thermal bleed-off valve on the secondary loop accessed from the underside of the left engine panel, Terrell Sell said. And you need someone to do it in the next 40 minutes. After that, you need a new engine core. Daniel's thumb moved toward a contact in his phone. I can fix it. That's not what I need to hear. I understand, but it's what's true. Victor Slade arrived in under 5 minutes. 2 men with him, professional, unhurried, the contained readiness of people trained to assess before they act. Victor himself was 40, compact, with a face that revealed careful amounts of information. The face of someone who had learned that expressiveness was a liability in his work. He took in the scene efficiently. The car, the smoke, the gathering crowd, Daniel Holt, whose name and face clearly registered, and Terrell. Sir, Victor addressed Terrell with the neutral professionalism of someone who had been given an objective and intended to achieve it without unnecessary friction. Can I see some identification? Terrell produced his Westbrook Shelter resident card. Victor looked at it, at Terrell, at the card again. Then he stepped aside and spoke into his radio, low and even. Terrell caught fragments, no fixed address, no employment record in the last 3 years. Prior incident at Creston Dynamics resolved, but documented. Daniel stopped moving. He was listening. We're going to need you to move along, Victor said, returning his attention to Terrell. Mr. Holt has the situation under control. He doesn't, Terrell said. But I understand why you have to say that. Something in the delivery made Victor pause. 2 seconds. But 2 seconds in a professional who didn't waste them was a pause. What do you know about this car? Victor asked. I consulted on the cooling specifications for its predecessor at Creston in 2017. I know the thermal architecture this system is built on. I know what that smoke pattern means, and I know what has to happen in the next 37 minutes. Victor looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the smoke, at his watch, at his phone, at the crowd, which had grown to 20 people and included someone from what appeared to be a local tech publication. So CR 8812, Terrell said. He looked at Daniel directly now. A report I filed internally at Creston Dynamics in January 2019. I identified this exact point in the prototype cooling architecture, the same architecture your car's system descends from. I flagged it as a structural risk and recommended design modification before production. Call any engineer who worked in Creston's thermal division between 2018 and 2020. Read them that number. Ask them what it is. Daniel went very still. The number wasn't in any public document. There was no way to know it existed unless you had been inside Creston's internal systems. That report isn't public record, Daniel said. No. How do you know it? Terrell looked at him steadily, because I wrote it. 38 minutes. That was the number Terrell was tracking. The crowd on the opposite sidewalk had reached 25. 2 of them were filming. The smoke from the vortex zenith was steady, not worsening yet, but not resolving, holding in that particular plateau that preceded the next stage of failure. Daniel paced a short distance away, phone to his ear, expression closed. Victor stood between Terrell and the car with the patient, neutral presence of someone fulfilling a function. Terrell waited. He was good at waiting. He'd had practice. After 3 minutes, Daniel ended the call and walked back. He stopped at a distance that was neither confrontational nor deferential. The calculate de Billionaire of someone who had not yet decided. One call, Daniel said. You give me a name. Someone working in the industry who can confirm you are, who you say you are. If it checks out, we talk about the car. Dr. Renee Ashford, Terrell said, Chief Technical Officer at Apex Systems in Chicago. Tell her Terrell Wade is standing on Caldwell Street next to a smoking Vortex Zenith. Daniel typed the name. Found the number in his contacts, which told Terrell something about the size of the professional world Daniel inhabited, and called. Terrell watched his face. He'd always been good at reading faces during phone calls, the way the receiver's expressions tracked what they were hearing before the words arrived. He watched Daniel listen, watched something shift. Not dramatically, because Danielson wasn't the kind of man who shifted dramatically, but in the quality of his attention, in the way his eyes came back to Terrell with different weight than before. The call lasted 4 minutes. Daniel ended it, stood for a moment looking at the pavement. Then he looked up. "She's been looking for you," he said. Terrell said nothing. "She said she sent messages, multiple times, that you never responded, I know. She seemed—" Daniel paused, choosing the word carefully. Not at you exactly, at the situation. "She's a good person," Terrell said. "She said—" Daniel stopped again, started differently. "She said if you tell me you can fix this car, I should move out of the way and let you do it." Terrell waited. Daniel looked at the smoke, at the diagnostics screen on his phone, at Terrell. "Victor," he said. "Let him work." Victor stepped aside, and the crowd across the street, 25 people with their phones and their morning coffee and their accumulated human curiosity, went completely quiet. Terrell set his bag down on the pavement. He didn't perform anything for the audience behind him. He simply still stood in front of the engine compartment for a moment and let himself set aside 3 years of sidewalks and library corners and folded tarps, and became, for the next 37 minutes, the thing he had always been underneath all of that: an engineer facing a solvable problem with available resources. He asked for the emergency kit. Sid retrieved the library's case from the trunk and set it in the pavement. Terrell opened it, assessed the thing quickly and accurately, turned to Victor. "I need someone to get 8B graphite pencils, Stettler Mars Lumographs specifically. There's an art supply shop 2 blocks east, Harmon Street. 6 pencils." Victor glanced at Daniel, who nodded. The younger of Victor's 2 men left at a controlled jog. Terrell opened the kit and began organizing. His movements were methodical, Icham positioned where he could reach it without looking. The efficiency some sort who had done careful work in cramped conditions before, who knew that the workspace was part of the solution. He identified the access panel, third from the left on the undercarriage of the left engine block. Removed it with the tool from the kit, set it on the cloth he'd laid on the pavement. The hiss of escaping vapor was immediately audible, the sound of the system releasing what it was supposed to contain. "There," he said, not to anyone in particular. The fracture point, exactly where the secondary and tertiary systems converged, exactly where the stress modeling had predicted weakness when he'd written Memo SAR 8810. That tiny crack is doing all this, the 6. Daniels had bounced closer despite himself. The secondary loop operates at significant pressure. A fracture that size allows coolant to vaporize against the thermal shielding. The smoke is the vapor. The problem is what the vapor does to the bearings over time. Terrell looked up briefly. $40 million and a career later, I can confirm. Small cracks matter. Daniel was quite quiet for a moment. That's reference to Creston. It is. The younger guard returned with the pencils at a pace that suggested he'd moved quickly the entire way. Terrell took the package, selected 1 pencil, and broke the casing open carefully to expose the graphite core. He began mixing the compound. Emergency sealant from the kit as the base, graphite worked in at the ratio he'd calculated in his head while walking to the access panel. The chemical interaction he needed was specific: graphite nanoparticles suspending in the polymer base to create a compound dense enough to hold under the secondary loop's operating pressure. Not permanent, not factory specification, but sufficient. He checked consistency. Adjusted. More graphite. The sealant smelled slightly off, an older formulation, probably 2 years past its optimal window. The adjustment was small but necessary. This was engineering, not the first plan. The correction when the first plan met the actual materials. He leaned in to apply the compound and found the bolt. Standard hex size, recessed behind the secondary access panel. It should have been ESIC accessible. Corrosion. The specific bonding that happened when a bolt was exposed to coolant vapor long enough to partially fuse with the surrounding surface. Not seized entirely, but close enough that the 5mm hex driver the job required was not a 4mm or 6mm, both of which were in the kit. Terrell sat back on his heels, looked at the bolt, looked at the kit. The crowd behind him had been holding its collective breath without realizing it, and the stillness deepened when he stopped moving. He heard someone shift their weight. He heard Daniel draw a breath as if to speak. He reached back into the kit and found an alignment rod, standard issue in high-end emergency kits for sensor recalibration, roughly 2 millimeters in diameter, metal which could be worked. He took the rod and the edge of the utility tool and spent 90 seconds shaping the tip. Small, careful adjustments, testing the fit of the bolt head twice between adjustments. Third attempt seated properly. He applied the modified rod to the bolt, found the grip, and turned with even pressure. Resistance for 2 full rotations. Then it came loose cleanly. He heard Daniel exhale. He applied the compound to the fracture with a small brush from the kit. 1 pass, consistent pressure. The way you applied something you couldn't undo. He held his watch with his free hand, 90 seconds. He gave it 90. Then he moved to the next stage, venting the contaminated coolant. This part was straightforward. The vapor-damaged fluid drained into the containment tray in its characteristic iridescent blue, slightly clouded by the degradation that had been accumulating since the fracture formed. He watched the color and estimated, about 40% recoverable with proper filtering. The rest gone. He replaced it with the emergency reserve. Standard formulation, not the specialized nano-coolant the secondary loop was designed for, but adequate at reduced output. Filled the system to specified pressure. Ran the manual pressure check. Numbers taste hacky clean. He closed the access panel, stood up. His knees registered the pavement. He ignored them. "Start the engine," he said to Daniel. "Are you certain? Start the engine." Daniel reached through the window and pressed the ignition. The Vortex Zenith came to life in stages. First, the initialization tone, a system running its own internal audit, then the harmonic of the quad motor engaging, high and precise, and then settling into the layered purr of a machine in correct operation. No smoke. The diagnostic screen on Daniel's phone updated, secondary loop pressure nominal. Quantum stabilization bearings, functional. System performance limited, recommends service within 21 days. 70% output, as calculated, more than sufficient for any distance in the city. The sound the crowd made was not exactly cheer. It was something less rehearsed, the sound of 25 people releasing breath they hadn't known they were holding. Someone began clapping, and others followed, the way people join something once it's clearly safe to do so. Victor's younger guard, who had run to the art store and back and watched every minute of what followed, started clapping before others. Terrell noticed that. He began cleaning up with the same attention he'd brought to the repair. Each tool returned to its position. The contaminated coolant tray sealed, the cloth folded. He worked through the cleanup until everything was as ordered as he could make it, then stood and looked at Daniel Holt. The compound should hold approximately 3 weeks under normal driving conditions, he said. Keep engine output below 70%. Get the proper nanocoolant replaced at an authorized service point. Don't let anyone tell you it requires a full assembly. It doesn't if they actually understand the system. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. The manufacturer told me the field repair was impossible. The manufacturer has a financial interest in you believing that. You fixed it with pencil lead, with graphite nanoparticles suspended in a polymer sealant medium. Terrell began returning items to the emergency kit. Pencil was the delivery mechanism. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then something happened that Terrell hadn't anticipated. Daniel Holt laughed. Short, genuine, the kind that escaped before it was approved. "I need to understand more about how you did that," Daniel said. He paused. "About quite a few things," he checked his watch. "I have an investor meeting in 2 hours and 40 minutes. My car is functional. I would like you to come with me." "To the investor meeting?" "Yes." Terrell looked at him. He'd been invited into professional rooms before as a courtesy, and discovered later he'd been brought as a demonstration of something. He was precise enough about human behavior to want us to understand what category this was. "Why?" he asked. Because you just solved a problem nobody else in my immediate network could solve, in a way nobody would have thought to try. And you knew things about my car's architecture that aren't in any public document. Daniel met his eyes directly. That's the kind of mind I want in a room when I'm making significant decisions. And because I think I owe you a conversation I should have found a way to have 3 years ago, even if I didn't know you existed 3 years ago. Terrell considered that. I'm not dressed for an investor meeting, he said. That's solvable, Daniel said. Victor, call ahead to Bretnan's on 5th. Tell them we need professional attire in Mr. Wade's scene ready in 30 minutes. He looked at Terrell. Consider it part of the compensation for the car. Victor stepped away with his phone. Terrell looked at Daniel Holt, this man who had called security, who had dismissed him in under 2 seconds, who had held his phone the way you held something against a threat, and who was now arranging emergency professional clothing with the casual efficiency of someone for whom this was a solvable logistics problem, rather than a significant human moment. All right, Terrell said. He bent to pick up the emergency kit and hand it back to Daniel. Took it. Daniel looked at the modified alignment rod Terrell had set on top. You bent a sensor calibration tool to make a hex driver. It was the right diameter, in 90 seconds. I had time to think while I was mixing the compound. Daniel looked at the rod for another moment, then he put it back in the kit. Let's go, he said. Behind them, as they walked to the SUV, the crowd began dispersing. Victor's younger guard watched them go with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from the professional suspicion it had started at that morning. He hadn't said anything, but he'd noticed that was something. And the smoke above the vortex zenith was gone. The car sat clean and quiet in the September morning, its engine at 70% of what it could do, which was still faster and more powerful than almost anything else on the road. Sufficient. For now, that was the word. The store on 5th Avenue was called Brennan's, and it had the quiet, dense atmosphere of a place where serious clothes were taken seriously. A tailor named Hugh met them at the door. He moved with the unhurried precision of someone whose entire professional life had rewarded accuracy over speed, and he looked at Terrell for approximately 4 seconds before pulling 3 jackets from the rack without measuring anything. Try the charcoal first, Hugh said. Terrell tried the charcoal first. It fit the way well-made clothes fit someone with good posture, as though it had been waiting for him specifically. Hugh made 2 small adjustments with a practiced efficiency that turned the fitting into something closer to a demonstration than an alteration, and stepped back. That's the one, Hugh said. He wasn't wrong. Daniel was standing by the window on his phone. He glanced over, registered the result, and gave a single nod before returning to his call. Victor stood near the door with the patient stance of someone accustomed to waiting in interesting places. Terrell stood in front of the mirror and looked at himself. He looked like a man who worked in a building with floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked like the person he had been 3 years ago, before the investigation and the closed doors and the foam pad under the Caldwell Street overpass. He looked like himself. That was a strange thing. Not a costume, not a borrowed version. The jacket and the man beneath it belonged to the same story. A story that had taken a detour through a great deal of difficulty, but had not, it turned out, ended. He turned from the mirror. Ready, he said. The ride to Meridian Tech's headquarters took 11 minutes. Daniel sat across from Terrell in the back of the SUV with the considered distance of a man who had questions and was deciding which one to start with. Victor rode in front. The city moved past the windows in its midday configuration, deliveries and commuters and the ordinary machinery of a place that didn't stop for anyone's personal crises. Renee Ashford said she reached out to you 6 times, Daniel said. She did. You didn't respond. No. Daniel waited. He was good at waiting. The practiced patience of someone who had spent years in rooms where silence was a negotiating tool, who had learned that the person who filled a pause first usually gave something away. Terrell looked at the city going past. When someone you respect reaches out, he said, there's a version of accepting the help that requires you to be the person who needs saving. By the time Renee contacted me, I wasn't ready to inhabit that version. Not with someone whose opinion of me I cared about. He paused. That's not rational. I know it isn't. But the ways men avoid a theory ring aren't usually rational. They're just something they can't say directly. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Pride. Pride is the polite word. What's the honest word? Terrell thought about it. Fear. That showing up broken to someone who knew you whole would make the broken version permanent. That she'd stop being able to see the other one. Another pause. She didn't, though, Daniel said. See you as broken. That wasn't how she talked about you. No, Terrell said. He turned from the window. Yeah, for your company's platform, he said. The thermal regulation system in the magazine. AT5729 is the foundational patent. I filed it in 2017. Creston, I licensed it and sold the license after I left. He looked at Daniel.
Did you know whose work it was when you acquired the license?
Daniel didn't look away. I knew the patent history. I knew the original filing engineer had left Creston under difficult circumstances. I didn't know his name. I didn't connect the name to a person. He paused. I should have. The acquisition team should have. We have a responsibility in that due diligence to know whose work we're building on. Yes, Terrell said. You do. They rode in silence for a moment. What do you see in the platform? Daniel asked. The Meridian system. What do you see when you look at it? Terrell had been thinking about this since the library that morning, since he'd traced the diagram with his fingertip. The foundation is sound, he said. The geometry of the primary loop is clean, better than what Creston was doing with the licensed architecture, actually. Whoever your lead engineer is, they improved on what they inherited. He paused. But there are 3 places where the system will fail that your current testing probably hasn't found yet. And there's a different architectural approach, one I've been developing in pieces for about 18 months, that would achieve the same outputs with meaningfully lower heat loss and lower manufacturing cost. Daniel looked at him. How long have you been working on this alternative architecture? 18 months of thinking, about 6 months of actual calculation. Terrell reached into his bag and produced 3 folded sheets of paper. These are working sketches, not finished schematics, but the mathematical basis is complete. He held onto them for a moment. These papers had been with him through a shelter common room, and a library left corner, and the underpass on Caldwell Street. They were on the backs of magazine pages and the blank sides of junk mail he'd collected from a recycling bin, and 1 piece of butcher paper from the Westbrook kitchen. They had coffee rings and pencil smudges, and 1 corner that had gotten wet in a rainstorm and dried slightly warped. They were also, he believed, the most significant thermal engineering work he'd produced in his career, which included work that had generated $40 million for a company that no longer acknowledged his name. He set them on the seats between himself and Daniel. Meridian Tech's headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a building on Harmon Avenue, designed with the confident restraint of a company that had earned the right to stop proving itself. Clean lines, considered materials, art on the lobby walls that wasn't trying to be art. Diane Okafor was coming out of the elevator when they arrived. She was 48, with the compressed forward momentum of someone's 17 priorities and had learned to address them in order without visibly switching between them. She saw Daniel and began speaking mid-stride, then registered Terrell and stopped, not with the assessing look he'd been receiving since morning, with something more specific, the look of someone who recognized a piece of work and was now confronting the person behind it. Diane, Daniel said, this is Terrell Wade. She looked at him directly. The 2016 Thermal Isolation Paper, Journal of Applied Thermodynamics. Yes, I cited it in our internal technical review for the Meridian platform. I assigned it in my graduate seminar at Georgetown before I left academia. She paused. I told my students the author had left the field. I never left the field, Terrell said. The field left me. There's a difference. Something in her expression acknowledged that. Not pity, acknowledgement. The clear-eyed recognition of someone who understood the distinction. and wasn't going to pretend she didn't. Terrell is sitting in on the investor presentation, Daniel said. Diane looked at Terrell, at his jacket, at the papers he was holding. Made a calculation he could watch it happening, efficient and honest, and arrived at a conclusion. Good, she said. We should talk properly after. She stepped back into the elevator. The doors closed. Daniel looked at Terrell. She means that. I know, Terrell said. She cited my paper before she met me. That's the clearest kind of respect. The conference room on the 32nd floor had the view that this kind of room always had. The city spread below in the way that made human activity look both meaningful and manageable. Diane produced a yellow legal pad and 2 pencils without being asked and set them in front of the chair she'd placed at the far end of the table. Terrell understood this. Not a performance position, but an observation position. Room to think without being in the center of it. He sat down and began writing immediately. Not notes in the conventional sense, 2 columns. The left one labeled with specific technical observations as they occurred to him. The right one unlabeled, what he suspected but hadn't confirmed. A habit from his years at Creston, a way of separating the known from the inferred, keeping himself honest about the difference. The room filled. Daniel at the head of the table. Diane to his left. 3 members of the Meridian technical team whose names Terrell logged and held. A presentation associate with a laptop. Then the investor, Roberta Finch, came in with 2 partners. She was 60 white-haired, with the contained, forward energy of someone who had spent decades making consequential decisions and had developed through that process both a high tolerance for uncertainty and a very low tolerance for imprecision. She took the seat across and 3 down from Terrell, looked at him once when she sat, a brief, thorough inventory, and returned her attention to the room. And then Gerald Moss walked in. Terrell had known he was coming. Daniel had mentioned in the SUV that Gerald was attending as a representative of Pinnacle Capital, which held significant seats in several companies in this space. Terrell had nodded and said nothing, and had been preparing for this moment since. Gerald chose a seat across and 2 positions down. The angle put the presentation screen in his direct sightline without requiring him to face Terrell directly. Considered placement. Gerald looked at Terrell once. Brief, complete, professional. Terrell looked back with an even steadiness he had been rehearsing without knowing it for 3 years. 52 now. The weight he'd carried at Creston had redistributed slightly, but the posture was the same. The particular uprightness of a man who has spent decades projecting authority and has stopped distinguishing it from actually possessing it. Better suit than he'd worn at Creston. The Pinnacle Capital badge on its lanyard had swung once when he stopped walking and then gone still. Terrell, Gerald said, the tone of a man acknowledging an unexpected guest in someone else's home. Polite and nothing more. Gerald, Terrell said, 2 words. A conversation that contained 3 years and $40 million. A server reset and a career and a foam pad under an overpass. Nobody else in the room knew what they were listening to. Daniel did. He was watching both of them with the contained, alert attention of a man reading a room carefully. He'd known something significant lived between Terrell and Gerald. Terrell hadn't explained it yet. But Daniel was perceptive enough not to need the explanation to know it was there. The presentation began. 40 minutes. Well constructed, clearly delivered, technically serious. The Meridian platform was real work, a genuine advancement in thermal regulation for quantum computing that would, if it performed as described, reduce the cooling overhead that currently constrained processing scale. Terrell listened. His pencil moved between columns. By the 20-minute mark, the unlabeled column was longer. 3 things. The first, a load balancing assumption in the secondary regulation loop that would perform correctly under laboratory testing cycles and degrade under sustained real-world throughput. Not immediately, over months, compounding slowly, outside the window of standard diagnostic alerts. The second, an interface tolerance problem between the tertiary stabilization ring and the primary heat dissipation matrix. The design assumed a thermal expansion coefficient that was slightly optimistic for the specified materials, small. But it compounded with the first problem in a way that would accelerate both failure timelines. The third was structural. The fundamental architecture was solving the right problem through an approach that was approximately 60% as efficient as it could be. There was a different geometry. The one in his folded papers, the one he'd been building in pieces on library tables and park benches, that would produce the same outcome with significantly lower heat loss and, he estimated, a manufacturing cost reduction somewhere between 22 and 28%. When the presentation ended and Daniel opened the floor, the first exchange was procedural. Timelines, integration questions, manufacturing partnership structures. Terrell listened and watched the room. Then Roberta Finch looked down the table. Mr. Wade. She said it with the confidence of someone who had done the research she needed during the presentation. You've been writing since we started. I'd like to know what you wrote. The room turned. Terrell picked up the legal pad. May I? He said to Daniel. Daniel gestured to the floor. Terrell stood. He described the load balancing issue first, specifically with the material science rationale framed so that the engineers in the room had the full technical picture, and the investors had enough to understand the consequence. He watched Diane stop moving. She set it down and looked at him instead. He described the interface tolerance problems second. Offered a specific solution, an adjustment to the expansion coefficient specification that would require redesigning two components, but would extend effective system life by an estimated 40%. One of the Meridian technical team members made a sound that was not quite a word. Terrell registered it. He stopped, looked at the unlabeled column. The third observation is architectural, he said, not a flaw in what you've built. What you've built is genuinely good work, but there's a different approach, a different geometry for the fundamental system that I believe would produce better outcomes at lower cost and with less heat loss. He reached into his bag, brought out the 3 folded papers, smoothed them on the table. Pencil on paper, coffee ring in one corner, slightly warped edge from a rainstorm 6 weeks ago. These are working sketches, not finished schematics. But the mathematical basis is here, and the geometry logic is here. He turned the papers so the room could see them. Diane walked from her seat to where Terrell had laid the papers. She stood over them for nearly a full minute without speaking. One of the other engineers was moved to stand beside her. Then Roberta Finch leaned forward. At 5729, she said. Terrell looked at her. I tracked that patent filing when it was submitted. My fund was evaluating Creston's thermal division as a potential investment in 2018. I remember the originating engineer was someone who... She paused. The license was sold to Meridian at a significant discount in 2020. I noted at the time that the price was inconsistent with the patent's evident value. I assumed there were legal complications stemming from the incident at Creston. She set down the paper she'd picked up, looked at Terrell over her reading glasses. I remember the name on the original filing. A deliberate pause. It was your name. The room was very quiet. Roberta turned her gaze down the table, to Gerald Moss. Gerald's hands were flat on the table. Absolutely flat. Absolutely still. The physical expression of a man who has run the calculation and concluded that any movement is a variable he cannot control. Gerald, Roberta said. Her voice was pleasant in the way that contained rooms sometimes went polite before the temperature dropped. You were VP of Engineering at Creston during the AT 5729 licensing period. That's right. And during the incident that preceded the sale. Yes, she held his gaze for a moment. Interesting, she said. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The word landed in the room and stayed there, occupying space. Gerald did not look at Frel. Terrell did not look at Gerald. The meeting closed an hour later. Roberta's 2 partners had shifted in their chairs twice during the final 30 minutes. The particular physical recalibration of people who had come in with a number and were leaving with a different, larger one. When the last investor filed out, Daniel waited until the room held only 3 people. himself, Diane, and Terrell, before he sat down across from Terrell and put both forearms on the table. That was significant, he said. Not praise, assessment. The load balancing issue will show up in your data within 6 months of deployment, Terrell said. The sooner you address it, the less it costs. I know. Daniel looked at the papers still on the table. Where have these been for 18 months? In my bag. Before that, in the library. Before that, in the Westbrook common room. You developed a potentially industry-changing thermal architecture in a shelter. I developed it wherever I happened to be. Terrell began refolding the papers with care. The work doesn't require an address. It just requires the mind to stay functional. That part I managed. Diane looked at him from where she'd remained standing, arms crossed, expression direct. The load-balancing failure mode you identified. Our testing cycles ran 24 hours. The failure appears at 36 for 40 hours of sustained throughput. We'd have found it during deployment. Yes. After your first major client called you. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, with the flat honesty of someone who didn't often say things she hadn't verified, that would have been very expensive. Yes. What would you have done differently in the system design? Terrell picked up the pencil Diane had provided at the start, turned to the yellow legal pad, drew a single line, the primary load distribution pathway, and began annotating. Diane pulled up a chair. Gerald Moss had left before the final investor departed. Terrell had noted the exact moment. Gerald standing, gathering his things with the unhurried movements of a man who had decided that staying longer was a net cost. A brief exchange with Daniel near the door. A nod in Terrell's direction that was complete and contained nothing. Terrell had returned the nod, no more than that. Because the conversation he needed to have with Daniel about Gerald was not a conversation for a conference room at the end of an investor meeting. It required a different kind of space. And some things needed to be said, once correctly, rather than multiple times in the wrong moments. He was ready to say them. But not yet. The SUV that took Terrell back toward Marker Street moved through the city in the late afternoon light. Lower now, the kind that made everything look briefly more forgiving than it was. He'd declined the offer of a hotel. Daniel had raised an eyebrow and not pressed. What Terrell needed was to walk back into Westbrook on his own terms, on his own feet, after the kind of day that he needed time to carry before he put it down somewhere. He got out at Caldwell and walked the rest of the way. The evening was cooling down. He passed the park bench where he'd found the magazine that morning, 8 hours ago. The magazine was gone. Someone had taken it or it had blown off. And the bench held a different person now, an older woman reading something on her phone. He walked. He thought about the 3 papers and what Dazane's expression had done when she'd bent over them. He thought about Roberta Finch saying his name from a patent she'd read 7 years ago. He thought about Gerald's hands flat out. He thought about what next. Because Gerald had been watching. Gerald had run the calculation the moment Terrell walked into that conference room. And the calculation Gerald produced was not going to result in a handshake and an acknowledgement of past wrongs. Gerald was going to respond in the way he had always responded to inconvenient truths. By managing the situation, by employing the tools that professional men with professional networks and professional legal relationships employed when they needed inconveniences to go away. Terrell had known this was coming. He had been thinking, in one form or another, about what he would do when it came for 3 years. He still was not entirely certain. But for the first time in those 3 years, the question felt like one he was positioned to answer from solid ground, rather than from the middle of the air. He turned onto Marker Street. Westbrook's lights were on, dinner service. Through the front window, he could see the common room. People moving, the warmth of a retrogum occupied by people who had nowhere better to be and had decided to make that a community rather than a condition. He pushed open the door and went in. The email arrived at 11:47 p. M. Daniel forwarded it the following morning with a single line, 9 a.m. My office, if you're willing. Terrell read it on the library computer at 7:30. 3 paragraphs. Hartwell and Crane, a firm whose letterhead communicated its fee structure without stating it. The language was clean and careful. The prose of people who understood that every word in a document like this was a choice with a cost. The substance. Terrell Wade had signed a non-disclosure agreement with Creston Dynamics in 2016 containing provisions that restricted the use of proprietary knowledge in competitive professional contexts. Pinnacle Capital, as a stakeholder in several competing with or sent adjacent to Meridian Tech, had reason to believe that Terrell's participation nested him in yesterday investor a violation. They were bringing this to Daniel Holt's attention as a professional courtesy. Terrell read it twice. Then he sat back in the Bay Library chair and looked at the ceiling. 3 years. 3 years of sidewalks and shelter meals and calculated invisibility, and Gerald Moss had not needed to do anything, because invisible men didn't threaten anything. One afternoon, in a conference room in which Terrell sat at a table and was seen. Within 18 hours, a law firm. What the letter told him was that Gerald was afraid, not regretful, not conflicted, afraid. Fear was what sluiced this kind of preemptive legal positioning. Fear of what Terrell represented now that he was visible again. Fear of what Roberta Finch's expression in that conference room had meant. Fear of a conversation that Gerald had believed was closed in March 2019 and had discovered yesterday was not closed at all. Terrell found this clarifying in a way he hadn't expected. He closed the browser, stood up, adjusted the strap of his bag, walked to Meridian Tech. Daniel's office faced the city on 2 sides, floor to ceiling, that could feel like display or could feel like openness, depending on the person inside it. Daniel was standing at the window when Terrell came in. He turned, didn't sit behind his desk, pulled 2 chairs to face each other in the center of the room and sat in one of them. Terrell sat in the other. No table between them. Deliberate. You read it, Daniel said. Yes. Where does it land for you? It's strategic. The NDA provisions from 2016 are written broadly enough to be argued either way. Hartwell and Crane know that. Gerald knows that. The goal isn't to prevail in a lawsuit. It's to introduce enough legal uncertainty that you distance yourself from me before I become a fixed part of the picture here. Does the NDA actually cover what you did yesterday? No. The proprietary knowledge provisions relate to Creston's specific technical data. What I presented yesterday was my own analysis developed after I left Creston, applied to a system that Meridian licensed from the patent I filed. Geometry in those sketches doesn't exist in any Creston document. He paused. I developed it while I was sleeping under a bridge. Creston doesn't own that. You're certain? I'm certain. Daniel nodded once. Then I need the rest of it. Not the professional biography. I have that. The part you haven't told me. Terrell looked at the city through the window for a moment. Gerald Moss was VP of Engineering at Creston when the prototype failed in March 2019, he said. He ordered the Phase 3 testing cycle to be shortened by 60 days to meet an investor demonstration deadline. I objected in writing 3 times. The first memo was filed January 14, 2019. Memo CR 88 whoa. The second went out February 3, yet escalated to the division head. The third was March 1, 9 days before the failure. Daniel was quiet. The prototype failed on March 10. Cascade thermal failure, 40 million in losses. Gerald stood before the board and attributed the failure to a fundamental flaw in the core's design produced by my team. Terrell's voice stayed even. Not from suppression, but from the particular flatness of someone who has said something enough times in their own head that it has been processed to its bare shape. The internal server was reset 72 hours after the failure. Standard security protocol, they said. My memos were in that system. I had no copies. I'd filed them through official channels in the correct format and trusted the system to hold them. The investigation found insufficient evidence of personal negligence. 8 months later, by which point the professional damage was complete. He looked at Daniel. Gerald's account was the one that circulated first. Accounts that circulate first have a structural advantage that later corrections rarely overcome. leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He was not, Terrell noted, looking at him with the expression of someone hearing a surprising story. He was looking at him with the expression of someone hearing a story that confirmed something he'd suspected. "You believe this," Daniel said. "It's not as an interpretation, as a fact." "I was there," Terrell said. "It's what happened." A pause. "I believe you," Daniel said. "Not because of the car yesterday, or the conference room, or Roberta's response to the patent. Though those things are relevant. Because the account is internally consistent with everything I've observed of Gerald Moss across 8 years of working in adjacent professional circles. Gerald is skilled at positioning, at moving at the exact moment when movement is least visible." He paused. "That's not an accusation. It's a pattern." Terrell nodded. "The question," Daniel continued, "is what you want to do with it. You now have platform. You have Roberta's attention and Diane's attention and mine. You have leverage you didn't have yesterday morning. Gerald knows that. The letter's evidence of it feels like to him." He held Terrell's gaze. "What do you want to do?" That was when Renee Ashford knocked. Not knocked, appeared at the glass door, knocked once as a formality, and was already opening it when Daniel looked up. She had the compact, forward energy of someone who had flown in from Chicago that morning specifically to be here, and was not going to begin by apologizing for that. She was 50. Gray coming through at her temples in a way she'd apparently decided not to address. She wore a jacket that communicated she'd come from somewhere with meetings, which she had. She'd had 2 calls on the plane, Daniel told Terrell later. She crossed the room directly to Terrell. She looked at him the way old colleagues looked at each other after too much time apart, with the specific attention of someone taking inventory, not of what had changed, but of what had stayed. Not looking at the jacket or the bag, looking at him. "You look like you've been carrying something heavy," she said. "You look like you flew here without sleeping." "I flew here without sleeping." She sat down in the chair Daniel had vacated, pulling it to complete the triangle. 3 years, Terrell. Spawn, and don't tell me what you told him." She nodded toward Daniel. "Tell Omi the actual reason." He was quiet for a moment. "Because showing up broken to someone who knew me whole felt like it would make the broken version permanent," he said. That she would stop being able to see the other one." Renee looked at him steadily. "That is the most self-defeating reasonable thing I have heard in a professional lifetime." "Yes, you know I never stopped seeing it. I know that now." She reached into her baggie and set a USB drive on the arm of her chair. "A systems technician named Ray Gabbard worked at Creston from 2017 to mid-2020, she said. He ran infrastructure maintenance. Part of his job in March 2019 was executing the post-incident security reset of the internal communications server." Terrell went completely still. "Before he ran the reset, he made a backup." Renee's voice was careful, precise voice, the voice she used when the information was significant enough to be delivered without embellishment. He said later it was instinct. 15 years of systems work, backing things up was reflex. He put the drive in his desk drawer that night and left it there. "He knew what was on it?" Terrell asked. "He didn't look. He told me he didn't feel it was his place." She paused. "But he read the investigation report 6 months after the incident. He started thinking about the drive more seriously then. But he'd already left Creston by the time he fully understood what he might be holding. Where is he now?" "He came to Apex Sys 18 months after he left Creston. He's been with me for 2 years. Careful engineer. The kind who backs things up because it's correct and then holds onto a USB drive for 3 years because he doesn't know what the right thing to do with it is." She paused. "He told me about it last night, after I called him, after the call with Daniel." She picked up the drive. I looked at it on the plane. The office was quiet.
"The trace messages are on the drive,"
she said. CR882 and the 2 that followed. Timestamp. Chain of custody intact. Ray documented the backup at the time as part of his standard pre-reset procedure. Along with the memos, there are Gerald's internal responses, not the ones he's in the official record, the ones he sent to his own team. She paused. "And a calendar entry. March 8th, 2019. Gerald's calendar. 2 days before the failure. A meeting with the demonstration coordination team. The attached note reads, proceed as scheduled. Disregard engineering hold requests. Timeline non-negotiable. Terrell looked at the drive. He had spent 3 years knowing what he knew and being unable to show it to anyone who could do anything with it. Not to the industry, not to the people who had moved on from the investigation before its conclusion, not to the hiring managers who had read the incident's summary and made their calculations and declined to call back. Ray Garrett had been holding the U.S. the desk drawer for 3 years and 2 months. Terrell picked it up, turned it over in his hand. It was an ordinary object, small, gray, a brand sticker half peeled on one side. It contained the difference between what Gerald had said happened and what had actually happened. He set it back down. Is Ray prepared to attest to chain of custody? He asked. He's already spoken to my legal team. He documented the backup at the time. The metadata on the files will confirm the times. The chain is clean. Terrell nodded. He stood up, walked to the window, stood there the way he'd stood on the sidewalk the previous morning. Not for the audience, not performing thought, simply giving the problem the time it required. He looked at the city below. He thought about what he could do. He could take the drive to our journalist. Several had covered the Creston incident in 2019. A story about suppressed memos and a deliberately reset server would generate significant attention, the career-ending kind. Gerald would lose Pinnacle Capital. He would likely lose more than that. He could take it to the Industry Ethics Board. A formal complaint, a process, slower and less dramatic and more thorough. He could take it to a lawyer and pursue damages. 3 years. Lost earnings, professional destruction, the specific costs of what happened to a man when $40 million got attached to his name incorrectly. There were things that could be attached to 3 years, which he looked at the city. All of these were available. All of them were, in their different ways, about Gerald Moss. And here was the thing Terrell had worked out over 3 years of library mornings and shelter evenings and calculations on hard margins. The thing Clint had understood about himself with a clarity that came only from having had a great deal of time and very little distraction. Gerald had already taken 3 years. He was not going to take the next 3. He turned from the window. The drive goes to the Industry Ethics Board, he said, through proper channels, with Ray's attestation and appropriate legal process. I want it filed correctly, and I want it documented. He looked at Renee, then Daniel. I want Gerald to have the opportunity to respond through the correct process. That's how it should work. That's how I always believed it would work, back when I was filing memos in a server that got reset. He sat back down. My involvement with that process will be complete and cooperative. I'll make myself available for whatever is required. He looked at both of them steadily. And then I'm done with Gerald Moss. Not because he doesn't deserve consequences. The ethics board will determine what those are. But because I've already given that situation 3 years of my life. Giving it more means it continues to define what I do with my time, and I'm not willing to do that. A silence. Renee was looking at him with an expression he recognized. The expression of someone who had expected something else and was adjusting to what they'd received instead. Most people in your position, she said carefully, would want more than a formal process. Most people as a citizen haven't done about it for 3 years, Terrell said. I have. And what I keep arriving at is this. The version of justice that feels satisfying in the moment. The press statement, the public accounting, watching Gerald Moss lose things in front of people who used to respect him. That version requires me to be focused on Gerald for the duration of it, and the duration of it would be significant. He paused. I'd rather spend the energy on what I was doing yesterday afternoon in your engineering lab. That's where the remaining years go. Not toward Gerald. Daniel had been listening with the quality of attention he brought to things he wasn't really important enough to get exactly right. What Roberta said in the meeting about the patent price being inconsistent with its value when Creston sold the license. She's going to follow up on that independently. I know. She doesn't need your direction to pursue it. I know that too. So the ethics board process and whatever Roberta initiates through her own channels will proceed regardless of how much attention you give it. Yes. Terrell looked at him, which means I can walk away from it cleanly. The process doesn't require me to be its engine. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, that's strategically sound and also genuinely harder than it sounds. Yes, Terrell said, it is both of those things. They moved to the offer. Daniel laid it out directly. Director of Engineering at Meridian Tech. Full authority over the Thermal Systems Division. A team to be built over the following 6 months. Lab access starting immediately, that afternoon if Terrell wanted it. A salary Terrell would have considered significant, even at the peak of his Creston years. Terrell accepted. One condition, he said it without preamble. Meridian co-funds a program called the 8812 Initiative. The name comes from Memo CR 8812, the report that nobody read. He looked at Daniel. The program identifies engineers, researchers, and technical professionals who have been removed from their fields due to disconnected from competence, employment gaps, housing instability, expired records, discrimination, the kind of things that register as red flags in a standard hiring review but have nothing to do with what someone can actually do. You want a talent recovery program. I want a correction. The talent is already out there. The pipeline is running. It's just running in the wrong direction for the people inside it. He paused. At the Westbrook shelter where I teach, there's a software architect who has been away from his field for 4 years because a medical crisis left him with a 6-month employment gap and a bankruptcy filing. There's a materials researcher who lost her position after a harassment complaint was turned against her. There's a man named Lou who has been attending my science 18 months, who has mechanical intuition I genuinely have not encountered since graduate school. He looked directly at Daniel. These are not hypothetical people. They exist today. Right now, their expertise is being wasted. You want Meridian to fund their re-entry. I want Meridian to fund the infrastructure that identifies them, confirms their competence through proper evaluation, and creates real pathways back. Not internships. Compensated professional roles. Not charity, investment. Because what I demonstrated yesterday with your car and in your conference room is repeatable. There are more people like me. The cost of overlooking them is measurable. He paused. I want the program independently enough to survive business cycles. And I want it named for the memo that nobody read, because every time that name appears in a grant application or a professional document, it means something about how we got here. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone. Roberta Finch picked up a second ring. Daniel put her on speaker and said, I have Terrell Wade here. I'd like you to hear something. Terrell described the 8812 initiative in 5 minutes. The rationale, the structure, the economic argument. Not only the human one, though the human argument was real and complete on its own terms, but the argument that talent misallocation produced measurable productivity loss and that a structured recovery mechanism was an underutilized market correction. Roberta listened through the complete 5 minutes without interrupting. 7 seconds of silence. Then, what's the initial funding requirement? Terrell said the number. He'd worked it out the previous evening on a piece of paper from the Westbrook common room supply shelf. The back of a sign-up sheet for a clothing drive with the specific attention he brought to calculations that mattered. Another silence. I'll match whatever Meridian commits, Roberta said. I have 2 colleagues who have been looking for something structured like this. I'll contact them today. 2 more questions. Sure. Selection criteria. Terrell answered both. Mr. Wade, she said before hanging up. I followed the AT 5729 filing when it was submitted. I thought then that whoever produced that work was going to do something significant. A pause. I'm glad we're having this conversation. The line went quiet. Daniel set his phone on the arm of his chair. Looked at Terrell. You came in this morning with a law firm's letter threatening your professional standing, he said. You're leaving with a funded program. I came in this morning with 18 months of calculations in a bag, Terrell said. The letter was just weather. Renee stood, picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. I need to call Ray and brief him on the ethics board process. She looked at Terrell. You know I'm not done with you. I know. Apex Systems has positions with your name on them. Technically speaking, they've had your name on them for 3 years. I'll call you, Terrell said. You'll call me this week. He looked at her. I'll call you this week. She put on her jacket. At the door, she stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, she said, I never stopped seeing the other version. The one you were afraid I couldn't see anymore. She paused. It was the only version I saw when you walked in yesterday. She left. The office was quiet. Diane met him at the lab on the 29th floor at 2 o'clock. She led him through the space with the focused attention of someone who had decided something and was following through on it. The lab had the accumulated character of real work. Whiteboards with partial erasure, equipment used enough to have been calibrated, notebooks stacked at the ends of benches in the slightly irregular way that happened when people were actually using them. Terrell moved slowly, checked the calibration on 2 instruments by hand, looked at the thermal analysis software and noted the version. Stood in front of the primary whiteboard, floor to ceiling, 8 feet across, for a full 30 seconds. Diane held out a marker. He took it. He worked for 4 hours. Diane stayed for the first 90 minutes, left when the afternoon's commitments required it, returned an hour later to find the board transformed. Not written on, exactly, but inhabited. The alternative architecture that had been living on the backs of upper margins for 18 months had found, in 8 feet of whiteboard space, the room it needed to exist fully for the first time. A thermal systems engineer named Ben came in around 3. He was 30, careful in the way that distinguished serious engineers from merely competent ones, and he stood near the whiteboard for several minutes before he spoke. The distribution pathway in the secondary loop, he said. He was pointing at the upper right section. Is that accounting for differential expansions in the tertiary line above operating threshold? 2.3% per degree Celsius, Terrell said, which gives you a tolerance window of approximately 83 hours at peak throughput before dribble degradation. It was quiet for a moment. Our last testing cycle ran 72 hours. I know. You knew without seeing our data. 'Cause it's the question I would have asked before I ran the test. Where's the window, and are we inside it or outside it? Terrell turned to look at him. Pull up your thermal cycle logs from hours 60 through 72. I want to see what the degradation curve looked like. Ben pulled up a chair. They worked until 6. Terrell walked to Westbrook, not because he had to. The situation had changed enough that alternatives existed. Daniel had mentioned a hotel. Renee had offered a colleague's apartment. He went to Westbrook because Thursday evenings were science evenings, and walking away from something without properly closing it was not how he operated. He arrived 20 minutes into dinner service, got a plate, sat at the table. Jalen found him within 3 minutes. 12 years old, settling into the chair across with his own plate and the air of someone who had noticed Terrell's absence and was going to address it without making a production of it. You were here Tuesday. I had something come up. Jalen studied him with the direct assessment of a child who was very good at reading adults and had learned that adults usually gave you enough to work with if you watched carefully. Something good, something complicated, which usually means good. Yeah, Terrell said, which usually means good. Amara arrived with her notebook. Old Lou settled into the chair at the table with his coffee and the comfortable ease of a man who had found in this back table on Thursday evenings something that had the quality of home. What are we doing tonight? Amara asked. Terrell set his fork down. I want to tell you something first, he said. They looked at him. You've heard me say that everything has a logic and your job is to find it. He paused. What I haven't told you is what happens when you find the logic and the people around you aren't ready to hear it. When you've documented the problem correctly, through the right process, in writing, and the system fails anyway. Jalen frowned. What do you do? You keep the work, Terrell said. That's the part nobody tells you because it sounds too simple. But the work is the thing that belongs entirely to you. It doesn't require the system's permission to exist. It doesn't require anyone to acknowledge it. It keeps developing whether or not anyone is watching. He paused. And when the moment comes, someone is willing to look at it. And that moment does come, eventually, if the work is real, you have something to show them, because you didn't stop. Amara was writing. Did it work for you? She asked without looking up. He thought about the whiteboard on the 29th floor, about Diane's face when she'd leaned over the papers in the SUV, about Roberta Finch saying his name from a patent she'd read 7 years ago, about Ben pulling up a chair at 3 in the afternoon. Yesterday it did, he said. What about before yesterday? Jalen asked. Terrell looked at him. Before yesterday it was harder to see, he said. But the work was still there. That was the part I could control. Lou set down his coffee, reached into his jacket, and produced a folded piece of paper. His own calculation, his own handwriting, the turbine problem he'd been wrestling with for 3 weeks. I think I see something, Lou said. I'm not sure if I'm seeing it right. Show me, Terrell said. Lou smoothed the paper on the table. Terrell leaned over it. Looked. You're seeing it right, he said. The approach in the second section, that's the one. Lou looked at the paper, at Terrell, back at the paper. Yeah? He said. Yeah. Lou sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who had just had something confirmed that he'd been half believing and half doubting for weeks. He picked up his coffee, set it down, picked it up again. All right, he said. 2 weeks later, 3 people from Swebbook attended the first orientation session of the 8812 initiative. David Carre, the software architect, came in a jacket he'd borrowed and shook Terrell's hand with the careful grip of someone who had been practicing being steady. He brought a portfolio of his work from before the medical crisis, printed on paper, because he didn't have a laptop, because some things took time to rebuild. The work was excellent. Joanne Reeves, the materials researcher, arrived with a folder of published papers and set them on the table with the measured composure of someone who had been keeping something safe for a long time and was now, carefully, letting it be seen. I don't know if the field has moved past these, she said. Terrell looked at them for 5 minutes and told. The field had moved toward them. Lou came in 5 minutes late, slightly out of breath, wearing a tie that he had not managed to fully center. He sat down and looked at the room with the expression of a man taking stock of something he'd been told was real and was now verifying. This is actually happening, he said. Yes, Terrell said. Jobs with salaries. Real ones. Lou looked at his tie, apparently decided it was sufficient. All right, he said, let's go. The 8812 initiative launched officially on a Wednesday morning in late October. 11 people in the orientation room. Between them, they carried decades of expertise the industry had misplaced through bad processes, flawed assumptions, accumulated weight of systems that had no mechanism for looking back at what they'd discarded. Terrell stood at the front of the room. He thought about what to say. He'd written notes and then set them aside. Notes had a way of making him sound like someone rehearsing, rather than someone speaking. The memo this program is named for, Helly said, was a report I filed to flag a problem I could see clearly and that the people around me weren't ready to look at. They weren't bad people. Some of them were genuinely good engineers. But they had a deadline and a set of incentives and a leader who had decided that the deadline had more than the risk, and the system didn't have a way to correct for that. He paused. That's the ordinary shape of how things go wrong, he said. Not malice as a rule, though sometimes that too. More often, incentives. Processes that reward speed over accuracy. Organizations that mistake authority for expertise. Systems that don't make space for the person in the room who can see the problem. He looked at the 11 faces looking back at him. You are here because systems went wrong around you. Some of you were the person who saw the problem coming. Some of you were the person the failure landed on. Either way, the result was the same. You lost time, you lost ground, lost for a while the platform to do what you're built to do. He let that sit for a moment. No one in this room is going to ask you where you've been. We already know the shape of where you've been. The question we're interested in is what you know and what you can build. He picked up a marker. Start there. He turned to the whiteboard, and in the room behind him, 11 people leaned forward. 3 weeks after that morning, Terrell was in the lab before anyone else arrived. 6 a.m. The city still assembling itself outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lab, quiet with the low hum of equipment running background functions, the particular sound of machines doing their maintenance work in the hours before the people arrived to make them do something more. He stood at the bench in the corner. His bench now, the one with the best bite sightline and the most wall space, which he'd covered in printed schematics and handwritten annotation sheets, and the two whiteboards he'd pushed together to make one surface large enough for the scope of what he was building. The alternative thermal architecture. The thing that had lived on paper margins and notebook backs for 18 months was becoming a system. Not a sketch, a system, with materials data and test results, and the growing stack of notebooks that documented the progression from theory toward something that could be built. He opened the current notebook to where he'd stopped yesterday, looked at the last line, picked up a pencil. The tertiary ring geometry was the remaining problem. He'd been wrong about the expansion tolerance twice, corrected both times, which meant he understood the error and could pursue the solution with confidence. The third approach was the one that was going to work. He could feel the shape of it assembling in the part of his mind that had been running continuously for 20 years without an off switch. He wrote the next line. Clean, precise, the way he wrote when the problem had finally given him enough to work with. Outside the windows, the city came into its morning. Ben would arrive at 7. They'd work through the tertiary problem together. Ben had started bringing his own notebook to their morning sessions, which Terrell had noticed and not commented on, but considered significant. Good engineers developed attachments to the problems they were solving. That attachment was how the hard problems got solved. Diane's would stop by mid-morning, the way she'd been stopping by since the first day, to check the progress and, Terrell understood, to verify something she was still in the process of believing. That the architecture in those coffee-ringed, rain-warped paper sketches was actually going to work. Lou had his first official project review at Meridian next Tuesday. He'd called Terrell twice to talk through the technical preparation. Both calls lasted 40 minutes and covered significant ground. David Carrar had submitted his first piece of code to the Meridian repository on Friday. Ben had called it clean, which from Ben meant something specific. Joanne Reeves had a meeting with Diane next week about integrating her materials expertise into the thermal architecture work. She'd emailed Terrell to ask if he thought her published work on polymer behavior and thermal cycling was relevant to what he was building. It's exact. The ethics board had acknowledged receipt of the complaint and opened a formal review process. Terrell had received the confirmation letter, read it, filed it, and returned to the notebook on his bench. Roberta Finch's legal team had initiated a separate inquiry into the circumstances of the AT-5729 license sale. That process would run its course without requiring his constant attention. Gerald Moss had resigned from Pinnacle Capital's advisory board the previous Thursday. Terrell had read about it in an industry newsletter on Monday morning the way he read everything in those newsletters. With full attention, in order, without skipping ahead, he'd noted it and returned to the notebook. He wrote the next line, and the one after that.
The tertiary geometry was resolving.
He could feel it the way you felt a solution before you'd fully articulated it, the way an equation became legible before you'd written the last term. It was going to require one more correction, one more adjustment to the expansion tolerance math, and then the architecture would be complete enough to move into the first serious prototype phase. He had a team to build it. He had a lab to build it in. He had 11 people in the 88 and 12 initiative cohort who were 3 weeks into remembering that they knew things worth knowing. He had Lou's turbine calculation, and Amara's composition notebook, and Jane's spatial reasoning, and whatever was going to become of those things over the years. He had been arriving at 7, with his notebook and his questions. He had work that was genuinely his, built in the margins of the attention pod, held all together through 3 years of deliberate discipline, now given the space it needed to become what it had always been moving toward. He had not everything. Not the 3 years returned. Not the 40 million properly attributed. Not the industry's collective acknowledgement of what had happened. That would come through the correct process in its own time and outside his control. But enough. The pencil moved. The morning came through the window, and Terrell Wade, engineer, patent holder, library regular, shelter teacher, director of engineering at Meridian Tech, and Stook's most careful thermal systems or thinker anyone in this building had ever worked beside, continued the work. Because the work was real. Because it had always been real. And because he had never, not once in 3 years, stopped.